So the University of Stirling opened in 1967, and it was the first new Scottish university in 500 years. And the first principal was Tom Cottrell. He came from Edinburgh, and he was actually a scientist, but he was very interested in art. His mum was an artist, a sort of amateur artist, and he'd obviously been raised to be interested in art. And he felt that students should just be surrounded by art as part of their education. There was a fine art department here for very briefly, I think, but that wasn't really what they were looking into. They just wanted art on the walls, and the Pathfoot building, where we're speaking from now, was the first building to be built on the new campus. And first of all, it housed everybody. Of course, it was a very small body of students the first few years and a small body of staff, but everybody was in this one building. And it was highly praised at the time. It was built by John Richard Architects. It was an Edinburgh architect, and they had to deal with a sloped site. So the building was built in tiers up the slope. It's very low rise, and it has a lot of courtyards. It has 17 courtyards, and it's beautiful light and an aspect and a lovely view of Stirling Castle from the slope. And then once they moved into the building, once they looked at it, there were an awful lot of windows, and it was also felt that old style paintings maybe didn't really fit with this 60s spirit of modernism. And they started to look at modern artists who might fit into the architecture of the period. So Tom Cottrell knew a lot of artists and knew about art, but he also felt that he needed a bit more advice. So he recruited or asked for some advice from Douglas Hall, who was the curator of the Modern Art Gallery in Edinburgh, the Scottish National Gallery in Edinburgh. And he, Tom and Douglas, and also the architect of the building, John Richards, started to think about artists that they might use for the building. And Mary Martin was mentioned when they were especially looking at the huge refectory at the top of the building, and they had a long wall, south-facing wall, that needed filling. Mary Martin's name was mentioned, and everyone thought she would be an ideal candidate to provide a wall construction. So Mary Martin was then approached by this small loose art committee at Pathfoot in Stirling, and she was delighted. She was really inspired by the space, and we have some small sketches that she was starting to experiment. It was going to be a mural of 60-foot length, so it was quite a major undertaking. And at first we know that she was thinking about colours to be involved, but eventually it seems that she just decided to do plain aluminium sloped cells, a whole series of them across the wall that would reflect the light shining in from the clerestory windows opposite, but also the people within the space. We know from early photographs that this was the case. They held early graduations in that space, and you can see all the colours of the gowns and the dresses of the ladies being reflected in this beautiful wall construction. She was clearly also inspired by the beautiful Pathfoot building and how it had almost been built in a modular sense that could be expanded upon over the decades as the university grew. And her own work was modular and was designed with the idea of a parent cell, similar to the Pathfoot building being a parent cell of the university campus as the first cell, and also with the beautiful linear nature of Pathfoot and the lightness and the openness. It was reflected beautifully in her work. Tragically, she didn't get to actually see it in situ because she died just before it was installed in the refectory building. So unfortunately, although it seemed like an ideal location, the refectory was of course full of bodies on a daily basis. It was a canteen, there was cooking, and there were people brushing past it. And it seems from the archives that very soon it became damaged. At first, we found in an old newspaper from the university that the maintenance people on site tried to repair it a little, but then it had to be moved up the wall a bit. We think in the later 70s, once it had been renovated several times. Unfortunately, parts of it were knocked down to the ground or were lost, and so it had to be moved a little bit further up the wall. And then when the Pathfoot building was developed in the later 90s, it had to be completely moved to a different space, and then it was moved into the crush hall, which is where it remains now, and it's high up the wall, and unfortunately now north facing, but you can still imagine how it must have looked in the refectory space in its original position. It was Heggie and Aitchison. They seem to have just been shop fitters and joiners, so they must have just received a design from Mary Martin and instructions on what it was to be made of, and then they built it. We have photographs, you'll have seen the photographs of the men building it and polishing it. But yes, it was made of wood, and then the aluminium planes were obviously glued onto the wood. And yes, then it was constructed, and we don't know much about how it was installed. And there were a few reviews of it when it first was installed, and reviews of the building, which are really glowing and obviously was very well received. Tom Cottrell managed to get 1% of the building cost for each building was allocated for art. So that's how they had a budget for art in the early days. And they spent a lot on art and gathered prints as well, and decorated the building, decorated each member of staff's office with prints. They could choose the prints, and there were many exhibitions, also visiting exhibitions, which must have been an awful lot of work for the first curator.
And the furniture as well. It was designed with furniture to match the building, wasn't it?
Mm.
Yeah, it's a beautiful, beautiful space.
Yes, so the art collection, of course, was very much a part of the beginnings of the university, and for the first few years there was a member of staff. She'd started as a secretary, Matilda Mitchell, but then became the curator, organised a lot of exhibitions, but she left in the early 70s, I think it was 74. We also haven't mentioned that the Mac Robert then was built, and that was an art space, and they had a designated gallery. So at first a lot of the exhibitions were in Pathfoot, and then they moved over to the Mac Robert. So there were exhibitions at the Mac Robert, and there was a gallery there until pretty recently, and about 20 years ago there was still a gallery space in the Mac Robert. So there were exhibitions going on, but there wasn't always a curator. And after Matilda left, she came back to visit and realised that since she'd left, they hadn't really collected any more art. And it was a bit sporadic over the years. Somebody was in charge, but it was usually just as a part of another role. And so during the 80s, there was hardly anything purchased at all from our records, and into the 90s there was another curator, Valerie Fairweather, who originally worked for the library and then became a curator as well. And she's still alive and has told her about her experiences and her purchasing, and she managed to get one major donation from the Scottish Arts Council, who had a major collection that they were then dispersing in the late 90s. And we managed to receive, I think it was about 12 works from them, from major artists. And then since around the turn of the century, since 2000, there has been a curator in place, and very small budget at first, but now the budget has increased, and there's also different funds available. So there's the Art Fund, and there's the National Fund for Acquisitions, and other bodies that will donate money. And so we've managed to keep the collection going, and it has quite a place now. It also depends, it must be said, on which principal's in charge of the university. So some principals have just not had an interest in art and haven't really appreciated the value of it, but the current principal has been very interested and very supportive, and the budget has reflected that. And so recently we have managed to make some quite major purchases over the past few years. Even recently, even during COVID and since COVID, we've managed to make some purchases. So of course there are still struggles and budgetary constraints. The staff has really developed over the last sort of 10 years. So now there are 4 members of staff who are looking after the art, and we now have an outreach officer who works a lot with groups of children or students, or does tours and maintains an interest in the art. And we also try to bring in public interest. We have an open day every year. We have an annual open day.
Kenneth, did he ever come and see Mary's work? Was he involved in...
I think he came to the opening.
Right, so he did get to see it.
Yeah, but yes, as far as the Mary Martin's concerned, it would be interesting if we could get some more funding to perhaps not take it apart, but move it in a modular way. We've experienced that with other works of art, that if a piece has been in one place for a long time, you tend to stop looking at it. Yeah. And if you move it somewhere else, sometimes we've noticed different colours, different designs. You might notice a signature on the work that you've never noticed before. There might be little details. And in fact, the current exhibition in the Crush Hall was inspired by moving one artwork, the Patrick Heron, out of the case into the Crush Hall just to put it away in the store for a while. And suddenly we saw the colours in a different way, and were inspired by the reds in that painting to bring together a lot of other paintings that had used red in them to put together that exhibition, which is called Inspired, after the inspiration that we got from the Patrick Heron. So I feel that if we moved the Mary Martin in one way or another, it would be a useful exercise just to get more people interested in it, and to have a bit more of a narrative. But of course it's a huge piece, and as we already know, it's easily damaged, so we don't want to maybe risk that. It would have to be undertaken with caution. Yeah,
definitely. But thank you so much.
No, you're welcome.
This podcast was brought to you by Nicola Foley and hosted on Buzzsprout. Music from Pixabay. Thank you so much to Fiona Clason for talking to me. I really appreciate you spending your time with me. Please join me again next time.